All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Securing Clean Drinking Water for Passamaquoddy Tribal Members. The current municipal water supply for Passamaquoddy Pleasant Point Reservation and the City of Eastport is delivered by a state-regulated utility, the Passamaquoddy Water District, and it's often discolored, odorous, and tainted with high levels of carcinogens. Passamaquoddy Tribal Representative Rena Newell has introduced LD 906 to address this unconscionable situation, and Representative Newell is with us today. Also joining us is Corey Hinton, attorney and leader of Drummond Woodsum's Tribal Nations Practice Group. Corey, Representative Newell, thank you so much for being with us today to share about LD 906, an act to provide Passamaquoddy tribal members access to clean drinking water, as well as sharing what is needed from all of us to advance this effort. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speakers, and then we'll tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send those questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them to ask at the end. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learn programs. Thank you again for joining us. And Corey, I think I'm turning it over to you to start it off.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here with you all again. Thanks to Maine Conservation Voters for inviting Representative Newell and I to meet with you about this important human rights legislation. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint presentation, so just bear with me for just a moment. Let's get started. Right, I think folks can see this.
Looks good.
Thanks. So I'll start with some background on the water quality situation at Pleasant Point with the water delivered from the local water district. And then this presentation will talk about the legislation itself, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. This entire situation involving the drinking water at Pleasant Point has existed for many, many decades, for as long as really anyone can remember. In the Pleasant Point, Eastport area, the water has been bad. At times of year, it gets really bad. At times of year, like right now, it may not be as bad, but it's very much cyclical in nature. And there's been various attempts to solve this problem over the years. The most recent attempt, I think, to just rectify this problem in a systematic way was in 1983 when the water district was created. The Passamaquoddy Water District is a state chartered nonprofit public utility that supplies water to the City of Eastport and to the Passamaquoddy tribe at Pleasant Point. The district was also set up to deliver water to the town of Perry. But the town of Perry, at some point a few years back, was removed from the water supply, and the district provided wells to Perry residents. Today, though, the town of Perry still has a vote, along with the City of Eastport and the tribe, on a board of trustees that runs the water district. The PWD sources this water from a reservoir called Boyden Reservoir that is fed from a lake called Boyden Lake. And the depth of this water body has significantly diminished over time. So I live in Portland, and my water comes through my pipes from Sebago Lake. They're piped at the bottom of the lake. Sebago Lake is huge, and the water that comes to Portland from that surface water supply is very clean. By contrast, Boyden Reservoir is at its greatest depth, somewhere between 10 and 20 feet deep. Sebago Lake is probably well over 100 feet deep in many, many, many places. This reservoir is shallow. It's become increasingly shallow over time. And as a result, and really what fills in the reservoir, what causes it to become more and more shallow, is organic material. It's sediment that collects in the reservoir, both from runoff from the roads, from the lake that goes through a stream into the reservoir. There's leaves and all kinds of things that end up collecting and becoming essentially silt and sludge on the bottom of the water body. That water is cleaned to the greatest degree that the water district can, and then is piped to Eastport and Pleasant Point. The water before it's cleaned is a very, very dark brown, and after it's cleaned, at certain times of year, essentially the cleaning process is unable to remove all of the organic material. And so as a result, when there are significant amounts of organic material in the water that's been stirred up and put into the water supply, the water can be discolored. It can be a brown or a yellow or a green or even a bluish color, depending on if there's like an algal bloom in the summer, for example. There's oftentimes a bad taste at these times of year and a bad odor as well. The smell of rotten eggs is something that's commonly described in association with the source of water. And it's really just at certain times of year when the weather becomes slightly more unpredictable. So in the spring and in the summer and early fall, when you've got wind events or rain events, you tend to have the water body itself is disturbed, and the organic material that rests in the body, in the bottom of the water body, is kicked up into the supply and then ends up going out into people's homes. This really becomes most severe in the summer, and in the community. I mean, it's well known that at certain times of year, you can almost count on there being pretty significant water quality swings that can sometimes last for weeks. When the water is discolored, and really throughout the year, the water district treats the water. And so, want to be really clear that there is an active process in place to try to resolve this. Generally speaking, for a water source like this, a surface water source, they treat water with chlorine. And there is a group of carcinogens that forms as a byproduct of the cleaning process. When chlorine, a disinfectant, interacts with organic material in the water, there is a group of chemicals called trihalomethanes that can form. Trihalomethanes are a group of carcinogens, and in particular, the type of trihalomethane that forms as a result of chlorine cleaning is chloroform. Folks may be familiar with chloroform in a general sense. It is quite toxic and deadly. THMs in general, when humans are exposed to them in large doses, there is an increased risk of cancer, of liver failure, adverse birth outcomes. There's a slew of health outcomes that can result from prolonged exposure to trihalomethanes. But even exposure at any level can be particularly dangerous to people with health conditions, the elderly, very young people. So THMs really at any level pose potential health risks, but at elevated levels and for prolonged periods, they are particularly dangerous. The water that comes to the community when the water is brown, we've done enough testing to know that at these points of time, trihalomethanes are very likely at elevated levels. Just last year, there was brown water for an extended period over the summer. And then at some point, the water started to smell like chlorine. And there were reports of people's skin being burned by the water and all sorts of skin irritation issues. And the tribe actually called the water district, and we asked if the water was safe. We gave the report and they said, oh, the water's fine. we've just been cleaning it. And that didn't quite sound right. And so we went and we were getting reports of people being really what we felt was harmed by the water, and pretty reliable reports and multiple reports. So we ended up testing the water, and the tribe tested 10 locations across the reservation, and all 10 of those locations had levels of trihalomethanes that exceed the levels that are legal under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And in some places, the levels were almost twice the legal limit for trihalomethanes. And we know that the levels were particularly bad in some places, like the elderly meal site where our elders live and gather for meals. The local school for a long time on the reservation had a policy of not allowing the children to drink water from the water fountains. And they had a practice of purchasing water bottles for the students so that they wouldn't have to use the water fountains. And so this just gives you a sense of, just how widely the community has been affected by the water situation. You can't, parents are afraid to bathe their children in it. And there have been videos of parents who have tried to fill up pools for their kids and the water comes out brown. They shock it, they treat it, the water is still an unsightly color. People are generally buying water or going 15 to 20 miles off reservation to fill up water. And this has been a constant problem that has existed for many years in the community. In about 2019, the water quality issues reached a peak. The water at that point in the late summer turned bluish green. And the chief at the time, Marla Dana, contacted me and asked if we could develop a plan to just start to examine this issue, to bring people together to look at it, talk about it, and try to solve it, taking a long-term perspective on things. And so the tribe went to the water district. We asked them to sit and meet and really try to think these issues through. We ended up forming a stakeholder group that includes the water district, which has representatives of 3 local municipalities. There was also the tribe, the state of Maine, the EPA, and Indian Health Service, and a bunch of tribal officials really just meeting on a regular basis to talk about the issues with the water system, to try to improve communication, to try to look at potential infrastructure upgrades. And this really was intended to try to bring forth short, medium, and long-term solutions. A part of this really, we feel like, to get the greatest long-term solutions that'll help benefit the community in the big picture, it's not going to be about just cleaning the water better, but finding new source of water. And so we're really trying to make the case that there's a public health reason why the water source needs to be changed and why significant additional investments are necessary for the water district. And as a part of that, we've been engaged in a significant multifaceted health research study involving Maine Health, including Maine Health's Research Institute, which is called Maine Medical Center Research Institute. Wabanaki Public Health is involved. IHS, which is Indian Health Service, and Maine CDC are also all contributing with the tribe to understand both from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective how the water affects the people. And by qualitative and quantitative, I mean, with respect to qualitative, what are people's perceptions of the water? What are the psychological effects that can be measured through discussions and interviews and focus groups? And on the quantitative side, looking at data to determine the extent to which water is having measurable health impacts on the people. And the early returns are showing that the water has both a significant psychological impact on people in a very negative way, but also that cancer rates and adverse birth outcomes seem to be higher at Pleasant Point relative even to other Passamaquoddy communities, and most definitely higher than compared to the state of Maine as a whole. As a part of these efforts, the tribe has worked with the district to get funding to make a large upgrade to the water system to help clean the water better, so that at least in the short term, we can try to remove some of the harmful elements in the water. And we've been working with Maine and Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, just a wonderful nonprofit, to get money to fund the purchase of carbon filters. And these filters will be like a polishing process that comes on after the water's been cleaned to an extent. And this is an example of a great collaboration between the state and the tribe and the water district to fund something that the water district didn't have the money to pay for. And even just the sort of coalescence around this idea, it all occurred as a result of these stakeholder meetings and really hashing out, what can we do? Okay, how do we fund it? Okay, who's got some money that they can tap into? The tribe ended up putting COVID-19 emergency relief funds into this. And that's just a signal of, how important we feel it is to help the water district do a better job. We've been meeting in those sorts of settings since January 2020, and LD 906 was only introduced after we saw, even after those discussions, that there were still really significant systemic problems that will obstruct the long-term ability of the tribe to get drinking water for its people and for the water district to do its job. So the legislation has really three primary pieces. The first part, and I'll go through all of these in a little bit more detail, but the first part of the legislation would provide a property tax exemption to the Passamaquoddy Water District. The water district is currently the only water district in the state of Maine that pays property taxes. They pay somewhere between $60,000 to $70,000 a year in property taxes. And they are constantly, and their engineer testified to this yesterday in the legislature, they are constantly running into financial limitations that negatively impact their ability to take on additional maintenance and really do the job that the water district needs to do. So the first part of the legislation will deal with that tax exemption issue and to bring equality there. The second part of the legislation would take two pieces of land that are already owned by the tribe, where there's known to be available supplies of groundwater, and it would take those lands and add them to what's called the Passamaquoddy Indian Territory under the Settlement Act. For those that don't know, federal law allows tribes to take tribally owned lands and put them into a protected, what's called trust status, so that those lands are not subject to local laws, can't be condemned for state purposes, and so that they're subject to tribal control. And so essentially, this legislation would take two pieces of tribally owned land and allow the tribe to put those parcels into that protected status. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, the legislation would allow the tribe and the EPA to regulate drinking water on tribal lands. As it stands now, the state of Maine claims exclusive jurisdiction to regulate drinking water on tribal lands. And that's reared its head in some pretty unfortunate ways that we'll talk a little bit about. This would essentially allow the EPA and the tribe to be regulating water on tribal lands instead of the state. And in doing so, the tribe would be able to access a broader range of protections and funding streams to help support clean drinking water efforts on its lands. So now I'll just go through each of those issues in a little bit more detail. The first section is property tax exemption. If you actually are reading LD 906, you won't even necessarily know what you're reading, because it's a very simple strikeout of this section of the Passamaquoddy Water District Charter. Again, this is not a tribally owned entity. This is a state legislative creation. And it has this language here, section 15, that says that the district is not exempt from taxation. The district actually some years ago challenged this because it felt that it was an unconstitutional, it was unconstitutional that this water district was the only water district paying property taxes. And the Maine law court essentially said, you're a creation of the legislature. The legislature has the authority to create you in a way that makes you different from other water districts, but that means that they also have the authority to remedy this issue. And so the first part of the legislation would ensure tax exemption. And the specific savings from local taxes for the municipalities themselves, we heard yesterday that these tax savings would be, I think it's $23,000 for the town of Perry, $43,000 for the city of Eastport. City of Eastport, for example, has a budget of over $5 million, and they have an overlay, essentially a surplus that they bank on every year of about $100,000. And so these tax amounts are almost de minimis. They are like inconsequential for these municipalities, less than 1% of their operating budgets. So this is something that we hope is pretty non-controversial in the legislature, although we understand it will have an impact on the municipalities. But for the municipality that's most impacted, the City of Eastport, they're customers of the water district, and the water district has said that these savings will actually cover the cost of maintaining those carbon filters. And so these savings, it's not like it'll be a loss to the city so much as it'll be a shifting of the money to help provide the city cleaner water. And we think that's a pretty persuasive line of argument. The second part of the legislation will take two pieces of tribally owned land and add them to the tribe's territory and put them under tribal jurisdiction. Both of these parcels of land are right near the reservation at Pleasant Point. One parcel of land we call Passamaquoddy, which means a place where the water flows, is immediately adjacent to the reservation. And the tribe's been developing a well there for the last couple of years. It should be online pretty soon. And then the other parcel of land is about 1.5 miles from the reservation. And it's known that there is quite a sizable amount of groundwater there. And that groundwater supply was studied a few years back with some federal funding. And that study of that water supply was to see if it could be an alternate supply for the water district. The town of Perry that's where the land is located, ended up passing a moratorium to prevent the tribe from pumping water and from testing water to be an alternate supply. And then they ended up passing an ordinance that severely complicates and makes a very costly process for anyone to use water for purposes other than really small level private uses. And so by taking these two pieces of land and putting them in trust status, protected federal status, the tribe would be able to use the water on its lands, the water that it owns the way that it wants to, which is as a drinking water supply for the people. And so an important thing to note is that this legislation will put those lands in the trust, or it would make them eligible to be put in the trust. And it would do so without the approval of the town of Perry. The town of Perry, a few years back in the early 90s, when the tribe approached the town about putting lands in the trust to build housing during a housing shortage, the town of Perry made the tribe pay $350,000 on top of what the tribe had paid to buy the land, just to get the town's approval. And the tribe simply can't afford to pay that type of money. And so here we're essentially going around the town because we feel like their handling of these situations has been, quite frankly, extraordinarily unfair. So this part of legislation is intended to really protect the availability of this water for the water district and for the local residents. The third big component of the legislation, sections 4 through 7, will essentially ensure that the Passamaquoddy tribe has jurisdiction over drinking water and the regulation of drinking water on its lands. Specifically, the legislation would make clear that the regulation of drinking water on tribal lands is an internal tribal matter that's not subject to state jurisdiction. It would allow the tribe to enact ordinances and enforce ordinances in its courts that relate to the regulation of drinking water. And then it would make clear that notwithstanding any of that, the tribe and the state and the water district can enter into agreements to jointly regulate drinking water issues. This is essentially how it works elsewhere in Indian country. Elsewhere in Indian country, outside of the state of Maine, tribes have the ability to regulate drinking water. Generally speaking, they do this with the EPA, where the EPA is sort of the primary authority, and the tribes work with the EPA. Tribes elsewhere in Indian country have the ability to apply to the EPA under the Safe Drinking Water Act for something called treatment as a state status, TAS status, and that would allow a tribe to essentially be the EPA for purposes of regulating drinking water. In that situation, the tribe would have the exact same jurisdiction that the state has, where essentially you're the primary regulator of drinking water until that process is completed, and it's a very intense, difficult process. The EPA would regulate water with the tribe. And in situations where elsewhere in Indian country where you have these water systems like PWD, which is an off-reservation water system that feeds multiple municipalities. There are examples of how tribes and water districts and municipal governments reach agreements to essentially agree to manage their parts of the water system. And there's a really good example of this with Navajo Nation. And it's really clear as a part of this that the tribe isn't seeking and really wouldn't have the ability to regulate and make more costly regulations for the off-reservation water district. Rather, this is really about ensuring that within tribal lands, the tribe can regulate water. This means putting wells online and testing water and developing programs for that. It's particularly important because we, in the last couple of years, in the middle of the pandemic, I mentioned that the school had a policy of not allowing the kids to drink the water from the water fountains that's delivered by the water district. There was a new school built using federal funds. And in the new school, the school board decided that it didn't want the kids to have water delivered from the water district at the water fountains. So they dug a well on the reservation to provide water just to water fountains in the kitchen for cooking. The tribe and the school thought that, this is tribal lands, tribal water, to tribal kids at a federally funded tribal school project. We can just dig this well and supply the water. Well, they did that. And I was contacted by the Attorney General's office, and their position was explained to me, essentially requiring the tribe to seek approval from the state to dig a well to supply tribal members on tribal lands drinking water. That was a very hard pill to swallow in the middle of a pandemic. But the tribe had to actually divert resources from pandemic response efforts to allow me to negotiate with the state an MOU to allow the tribe to essentially have a well getting clean water to kids. So ironic, just so ironic that the state insisted on regulating that well when it hadn't done a good enough job regulating its other water supply to ensure that there wasn't brown water certain times a year. But that whole experience, being told by the state, you need our approval to get a well to get water for your kids, that's why this legislation is here. The tribe feels that it should be the primary, working with the EPA, the primary governments to regulate drinking water within tribal territory. And it feels like the state of Maine really, quite frankly, should have little to no say in that. The other significant part about the legislation, just with respect to sort of equalizing the tribe's drinking water rights relative to tribes elsewhere, is to ensure that the tribe can essentially implement the Safe Drinking Water Act. And this sort of builds off of what I said before, but there's a part of the Settlement Act that prevents tribes in Maine from accessing federal laws passed by Congress since 1980. And the Safe Drinking Water Act is an example of a law that had been amended in post-1980 in ways that would help tribes and in ways that have been prevented from applying in Maine. And so we have some specific language in LD 906 to make clear that the tribe can access the Safe Drinking Water Act like tribes can elsewhere. And we know that the state of Maine is very much opposed to these parts of the law that essentially would give the tribes access to federal law under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And we know that the state is also opposed to the tribe having jurisdiction over drinking water on its lands. But other than that, the state has generally been pretty supportive of the bill. And that really covers, I think, the big parts of the legislation. So at that point, I'll turn off screen share. Representative Newell, what did I miss?
Good morning, everyone. I am Representative Newell, and I'm so happy to be with you today. And I think you would all agree that Corey did an excellent presentation. So she will win, Corey, and we'll absolutely open it up for any questions, but I do appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us today.
I'll second that, Representative Newell. What an informative and really shocking presentation. So thank you. Thank you both for being with us, and thank you all for joining us today. Later this afternoon, you will get an email with a recording of this program, but also a couple of ways that you can follow up and take action, because I'm seeing in all of the comments that have come in, and you can keep sending those questions to me, but lots of you are saying, how has this been allowed to continue, and what can I do? So we've got a couple of ways that you can help. First, that email will include a couple of articles that were published in the Maine Beacon that go into a lot of the history that we just heard, with some personal stories as well. They're great to share out to your friends who weren't with us today. You'll also find a link to an action alert that will make it really easy for you to email your state lawmakers and let them know that we expect LD 906 to pass, and to do everything that we can to make sure that that happens, and that the people of Passamaquoddy Pleasant Point Reservation and the City of Eastport have clean water. That is a basic expectation that we have, and we'll send that action alert so that you can make it clear to your lawmakers. There are a bunch of questions, but I just want to start by sharing a comment that I got from one of our Lunch and Learn regulars, who said, honestly, I'm having a hard time coming up with questions because I can't think of anything other than, are you kidding me? How has this been allowed to happen for so long? How long has this, Corey, did you say 1983? Is this really, we're talking decades?
Yeah, it's I mean, it goes back past 1983. Essentially, there was a water company that was managing and delivering water to these areas pre-1983, and they were kind of failing, and the water quality was extraordinarily poor, and they were having a hard time just meeting their basic obligations to the customers. And so the tribe actually stepped up with a bunch of money post-settlement act to help start a new water district. And that was the water district that, essentially was created under, through state law with funding from the tribe. And the water, I understand, for a while was better post 1983. It got better than it was, pre-83 with this failing water company. There was renewed focus, and there was this water source that was identified in Boyden's Reservoir. But as I mentioned, the reservoir has become increasingly shallow over time. And so the water quality problems have become more severe. And now that we see, with climate change and more unpredictable and potentially more severe weather events, we see a problem that is metastasizing. And we see that it seems like there's a bit of a sort of irreversible decline that the water supply is in. So I don't want to say like it's always been bad, but for people that were born in, and grew up in this area, and Rena can talk about this. I mean, even before our time, there are elders who grew up with no running water, and people that have been interviewed as a part of that, a part of the research, explain that they were traumatized by having no running water in their homes and having to go fill up water. And then finally, things are changed in 1983, and boom, a few years later, the water starts to get really bad again. And I've heard elders say that when they get the bad water, the brown water, it like takes them back to these experiences as a child when they had no water. Because essentially, when you have brown water, you might as well not have water. And this cycle of trauma is intergenerational. And so, didn't really start in 1983, but that's certainly an important point in the timeline.
I want to thank you for making really explicit the intersection of threats and of vulnerabilities here, because I think, as we learn more about the environmental justice movement, and we talk a lot about how people are subject to various forces, and in just pulling out the way climate change is exacerbating this issue, it just feels really real. So thank you. I want to go back to this structure of the Passamaquoddy Water District, because it it has a different status than all of the other water districts in the state. That's right? And that's why they have to pay water tax, or they do have to pay property taxes?
The charter of the water district was created by state law, and it was written by the legislature the way that you see it today. And my understanding is that these charters are created by the legislature, and so technically the legislature can, create them differently. And there was a decision made to create this one differently than all others. But Representative Newell did some interesting research on this, and I don't know, Representative, if you want to add anything to like the creation of this based on what you've seen.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. As we understand, the Passamaquoddy Water District was established by legislation in 1983. However, in doing the research for this particular piece of the bill, I requested the legislative history, and I learned that in 1929, the legislation put forth what created the Eastport Water Company. And what I'm hearing now, although today we do know that the Passamaquoddy Water District is the only district that has a tax liability attached to it, in which we're trying to make changes to that through this piece of legislation. What I found was that from 1929 to 1983, in my research, told me that they were a tax exempt public utility. I don't have a complete understanding as to what took place between that timeline and in 1983 and it becoming, the only public utility that is no longer tax exempt. So as Corey mentioned in the presentation, we felt that making changes to the district charter would help, put those resources that have to go out to pay taxes back into the district's infrastructure, in order to, cover the cost of any upgrades, but long-term, certainly short-term to them, I don't know how you want to put it, in redirecting those funds would certainly improve water quality. Yeah.
Thank you for doing all of that research. It sounds like a really a big lift to get to the bottom of how this has happened. And thank you for giving us the pieces of that to try to wrap our heads around it. Going back to another piece with the town of Perry. So am I right that essentially the town of Perry opted out of the Passamaquoddy Water District and now has been able to secure clean, safe drinking water for their residents? Is that right? But well, maybe I should stop there. Is that right?
Well, it's interesting. I heard anecdotally for a while that from a few different people that at some point the water district took Perry off of the water supply and bought them new wells. And when you hear that, and then you hear that the town of Perry is like one of the big opponents to a lot of the efforts, it's like there's something about this seems off. And I'd only heard this from different places. And then yesterday in the work session, the Passamaquoddy Water District engineer, he said it flat out that at some point, and I don't know exactly how long ago it was, they decided that a part of their water system, they were having a hard time maintaining water quality in a part of their overall system. And so they severed the system and they bought wells for these people. And meanwhile, other parts of their system are having water quality problems. And, we're putting forth COVID relief funds to help solve this problem, and it just seems like there's a massive inequity in how the resources have been, allocated over the years. And it's a really weird thing. I mean, with the water district, they like to say that the tribe maintains its own part of the water system. But yet we know that they've made large capital investments in the city of Eastport to replace pipes and to do all of these things. Yet they say that it's the tribe's obligation. This is historically how it's been. It's the tribe's obligation to take care of your side of it. And then they suggest it's the tribe's problem that we have these problems. Like it's our infrastructure that contributes and is a dispositive factor in the water quality problems. Meanwhile, they're very active in other communities. And it's just an unfortunate dynamic. And it's one that is being laid bare here for the first time, I think, ever. And it's very important, I think, for people to recognize how systems can operate against people that, are historically disadvantaged in these sorts of settings. This water district was created in a way that would have representation from all of these different communities, but was hamstrung at its creation. And so it's not surprising that we see how, 40 years later, they are able to better serve certain communities than others.
Because this is an issue of environmental justice, it feels relevant to just clarify, what's the racial makeup of the town of Perry?
I don't know, but I think very interestingly, there's a sizable Passamaquoddy population in the town of Perry. It's one of these sort of like interesting hypocrisies. There are many tribe members that live in Perry, and we've done the research to know that some of those tribal members, they had wealth put in by Perry, but it's because they lived in Perry, what we now call Perry, right? This is like Passamaquoddy backyard. But the tribe is a significant landowner in Perry. We pay significant amounts of taxes to Perry. And yet I think there's a record that shows that we don't receive an equal level of services and access to services in the town of Perry. I mean, the water situation is one, but I've heard of tribal members going to the town hall in Perry and being denied access to permits to do things that, their neighbors can get permits to do in Perry. And that's just the way it is there. I don't know, Rena, is there anything you can add on that one? I don't want to go too
No,
deep.
not at all. Thank you. I think it's important to note this, and I think I just have to note this, that Pleasant Point, our location here in Sabayak, is located within the town of Perry. So not only do I find myself as being a citizen of Sabayak, a tribal citizen of Sabayak, I also feel as though I should be viewed as a citizen of the town of Perry. And I do feel a responsibility from the district as well, as a customer of the district. They do have a responsibility to the community here in Pleasant Point, also known as Sabayak. So I just wanted to make that point. And I think what Corey mentioned too, about the services do vary. Not sure why though.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that, Representative Newell, about the layers of identity, right? No one is, and being a citizen of Passamaquoddy and of Perry, it's complicated. We have some folks on the call today who are much quicker with their Googling than I am, and have got a couple of facts. So since I asked the question, I'll share the answer provided by the old Google. There are, as of 2010, because Wikipedia hasn't updated with the recent census results yet, there were 889 people living in Perry, 85.5% white, 10.5% indigenous. So
those are high levels of indigenous people.
Okay.
Most communities, just so folk, I mean, I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but like when you consider that we're like less than 1% of the overall population of this country, that's not an insignificant number.
Okay. Yeah, the disparity between people who are served by the same water district but getting very different water quality is striking. Let's see. So some of the data that you shared and the research and the tracking, the water quality testing and monitoring, it feels like there must be a financial and certainly an administrative burden associated with doing all of that work. And that feels like it's just adding insult to injury here. Who's been bearing the costs? I know you mentioned COVID relief funds have helped fund some of the recent work, but this has been going on for a long time. Has this been a financial burden on Pleasant Point for all that time?
Yes, of course.
And have there been surveys, so some of the health issues, we have someone on the program today who says, growing up in Eastport and Pleasant Point, I suffered repeated infections and ulcers and have lifelong damage and know folks who have the same issues. Is there any estimate of how many people have been harmed and how seriously? I mean, any level is unacceptable.
No,
but...
I don't think so. We, I mean, in the past 3 years, there's been significant resources put into, I think, all facets of this. Like my time, I mean, I'm embarrassed, quite frankly, that so much of my clients' resources have been dedicated to my time to do this. Significant amounts of my clients' resources have been dedicated to allowing their staff to engage with healthcare research institutions and, working on the problem solving. And the health data side of it is, it's all still being looked at really carefully right now. And so I can't say specifically what the conclusions will be, but the early results are showing discernible trends. And so, if we can say that, like, over the past 10 years, you go to Pleasant Point and you live there and you get health services there, you're more likely to have cancer, a THM cancer. You take that and you go back decades and, there are many people's lives that have been negatively affected, and it's about health, birth outcomes too. And so we're talking about children, being born negatively impacted, and it's all about correlations, and and we don't know how strong all of these correlations are right now, but like they are there and we see them. And the cost, the public health cost it's significant. I mean, the tribe is putting so much money into this that it's insane. And quite frankly, to go into the Judiciary Committee for days like yesterday and to experience what I experienced from certain members of the Judiciary Committee, knowing all of the time and the resources and all the studying that I've done shows that we got a lot of work to do. I mean, there are people that could care less about cancer or brown water or anything if it means that, somebody else on the other side of the town line might get negatively affected just a little bit. And so, people don't necessarily care about those health outcomes as much as we thought that they might. And that's, part of the challenge that we have.
I'm so sorry. There are no words for how unacceptable this is. And clearly from all the comments that have been coming in, that's a feeling that is shared by everyone on this call. What is the fate of LD 906 look like in the legislature? You mentioned that yesterday was not necessarily smooth. Do we think that LD 906 has the support that it needs from the legislature and the governor to become law?
No. I think that the legislature might support this moving through both chambers. But the governor's office, as of now, does not support all facets of this legislation. And I mentioned that during the presentation, in particular, the governor's office opposes provisions of the bill that would give the tribe the ability to regulate drinking water on its lands. And the governor opposes the tribe working directly with the EPA to solve these problems on tribal lands. And so that's just the reality right now that we're looking at. And I don't know, if there'd be enough votes to override a veto. It's possible that, there isn't a veto. We're in touch with the governor's office, but it's clear that, what we're hearing for them is like, this is politics, is I think what the governor's office told me last. This is a political issue. And I think if you think that this is a political issue, then we're never going to see eye to eye, because it is a human rights issue. And unfortunately, there are many segments of Maine's political demographics that think it's politics. And, I'm not sure that we quite have the votes to override a veto, but we're certainly angling for it.
That's where our action alert comes in, and letting our lawmakers know, no matter what part of the state we live in, no matter who we are represented by in the legislature, this is a human rights issue, and we expect them to do the right thing. So he will all get that opportunity.
Could I add something on that note, Kathleen? There are certain people in this room. There's a lot of people in this Zoom room that we're in, and some of us have varying levels of access to different places of Maine's power structure. And I just want to say that we shouldn't need a veto override. We shouldn't need to get 2/3. The governor should sign this bill because it's the right thing to do, period. This legislation only exists because our experience in trying to negotiate 1626 and trying to deal with these issues through broader brushstrokes was illustrating the significant complexities to trying to successfully do so. And so we did this to be really narrow about really narrow, but like really, really significant issues. And we think that there is just like, this should be a nonpartisan issue. And so if you can talk to the governor, please do. Write letters, call. I don't know how else we get through it though, honestly. Representative, what do you think?
Chiwili won Corey for making that statement. But at the same time, it's 2022. There's no doubt that this is unacceptable. And I think that's what gives you and I the strength to stand in a room, surprisingly, that holds opposing views, towards allowing, the people that we represent, who at the very least are human at their core, to receive the same amount of treatment as any other individual of this state. To me, we come forth to make the statement that this is an important issue that we need to stand up and address. But it's also the tribe coming forth to exercise their right to self-determination, to allow us to govern the best interest over our people, our community, my community. That to me is what this is all about. That's where I take my strength from in approaching this subject. We heard the testimony come from tribal elders, non-tribal elders. We had our children, watching this. Could you imagine your child viewing this issue over their basic human right to have access to clean water? This is why I will stand on this issue, so that future generations of our children or anyone else's children do not have to feel the indifference that they feel. This is an absolutely important issue. It really is. And I don't, I never saw myself, having to present testimony, asking the state government to grant access to the tribal citizens of Passamaquoddy and Sabayak, the people that I represent, to water, to a basic human right. Chi-Willy-Wan, Corey.
Thank you, Representative Newell. Your eloquence and your passion and your commitment and courage are inspiring. And I think we are, I think I can probably speak for everybody in this room that we stand with you and are just so overwhelmed and ready to do everything we can. And Corey, thank you for that reminder that, if you happen to be someone with the governor's phone number in your contact list, now's as good a time as any to give her a ring. Thank you all for being with us today. This has not been an easy hour, but it has been a vitally important hour. And I am grateful to every one of you for joining us, to Representative Newell and to Corey Hinton for your ongoing advocacy and generosity in sharing this experience. If it is hard for us to hear some of the things that you've shared today, I can't imagine how difficult it is to share them. So thank you. We appreciate you. You will all get a follow-up email this afternoon. I encourage you to forward it to everyone you know. Direct them, if nothing else, to listen to the last few minutes of the recording, and Representative Newell said it all. So please make sure that as many people as possible hear that message, take that action, and make sure that LD 906 and 1626 are signed into law.
I appreciate your time with us today, Kathleen, Corey, Hinton, Chi-Willy-Wan, and I would just say, just following the words of my great-great-grandfather, Lewis Mitchell, who was a tribal representative to the Maine State Legislature, please don't take any offense from my message. That was not my intention. And if my words speak with passion, it's in a good way only. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all. We will be back here next week with a program on how Supreme Court confirmations work, which is a good reminder that it really does matter who represents us in the legislature and the judiciary. I hope to see you then.